The uneasy night. The evening was quiet in the suburban neighborhood of Milford Heights. It was one of those nights where the city, tired from the hustle and bustle of everyday life, seemed to let out a long, deep breath. The streetlights flickered faintly, casting shadows on the empty sidewalks, and the faint hum of the distant highway seemed muted in the cool night air. The kind of night where everything feels calm on the surface, yet something about it feels different, like the calm before a storm. Lucas Grant, a police officer who had spent more than 2 decades on the force, cruised down the empty streets in his patrol car. His headlights illuminated the quiet road, the steady rhythm of the engine a comforting sound amidst the stillness of the night. He had seen plenty in his years of service: the routine traffic stops, the minor disturbances, and the occasional serious crime. But tonight, there was something about the air, something in the way the shadows stretched and twisted, that unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Lucas had been working the night shift for over 2 years now, and as the hours dragged on, his mind often wandered, reflecting on cases from the past, the faces of people he had helped, or, in some cases, failed to save. But tonight, there was no room for distractions. His focus was sharp as ever. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, to sense when something wasn't right, even in the most peaceful of settings. But that evening, something tugged at him, a feeling that he couldn't shake, a knot in his stomach that seemed to grow tighter with every passing minute. The patrol car rolled slowly down the familiar streets of Milford Heights, the same neighborhood he had patrolled for years. It was a quiet town, where crime was rare, and the people were kind. But there was always that one night, that one moment when things would change, when a calm evening would suddenly take a turn, and everything would feel out of place. As Lucas turned a corner near the local Walmart, something caught his eye. His headlights swept over the street, and in the distance, standing alone by the dimly lit alley, he saw her. At first, the figure seemed to blend into the shadows, a small silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of the darkened alley. Lucas's trained eyes quickly made out a small child, no older than 8 or 9, her small frame illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights. She stood perfectly still, looking directly at him, her eyes wide and filled with an intensity that seemed out of place for a young girl standing alone at this hour. Lucas slowed the patrol car as he passed, his instincts kicking in immediately. There was something about the way the girl stood, frozen, almost waiting for something, that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. A child, alone, at this hour, in a neighborhood that was usually safe. Something was off. He couldn't explain it, but it didn't sit right with him. His gut told him to pay attention. The wheels of the patrol car rolled to a stop as he brought the vehicle alongside the curb. He was close enough now to get a better look at the girl. She was wearing a bright yellow t-shirt, the cheerful color a sharp contrast to the somber mood that had settled over the street. Her long, dark hair hung loosely around her face, and there was a slight tremble in her posture, as if she were unsure of whether to approach or stay where she was. Her tiny hands were clasped together tightly in front of her, and her gaze remained fixed on Lucas as he sat in his car, watching her. "Hey, kid," Lucas called out, rolling down his window. His voice was firm, but not unkind, as he tried to approach the situation with the calm professionalism he had honed over the years. "Are you lost?" The little girl didn't move, didn't respond. Her eyes locked onto his with an unsettling intensity, and for a moment, Lucas wondered if she could even hear him. She didn't look frightened, just confused. But there was something in her expression, something that felt too heavy for a child so young. The stillness around her seemed to deepen as he waited for a response. Then, without warning, she raised her hand slowly, pointing to herself, then to the car, and then back to herself again. The movement was deliberate, purposeful, and it sent a chill down Lucas's spine. It was as if she were trying to communicate something that wasn't immediately clear, something that didn't make sense. Lucas leaned slightly forward, trying to catch her eye. "Are you okay?" he asked again, but his voice softened this time. Do you need help? Still, no response. She just stared at him, her eyes wide and searching, as if she were trying to tell him something in a language he couldn't understand. For a moment, Lucas thought she might speak, but then the words that came from her lips were nothing like what he expected. Help me. Two simple words, spoken barely above a whisper, but they hit Lucas like a thunderclap. He froze for a split second, the words echoing in his mind. His professional training kicked in immediately, but this was no ordinary situation. He had heard cries for help before, but this was different. There was something about the way she spoke, the urgency in her voice, that made his heart race. Lucas didn't hesitate. His instincts as a police officer, honed over years of experience, overrode any caution he might have had. He quickly opened the door and stepped out of the patrol car, keeping his gaze locked on the young girl as he walked toward her. "Where's your family? Are you alone?" he asked, his voice gentle, but his mind already racing, trying to piece together what was happening. The girl didn't answer at first. She simply looked up at him, her eyes full of fear and something else, something that made the air around them feel heavy. She glanced over her shoulder, a slight tremor running through her small body, before she spoke again. This time, her voice was softer, but the words were filled with an urgency that chilled him to the bone. "He's coming." The words hit Lucas like a brick. His stomach dropped, and for a split second, the world seemed to spin around him. Who was she talking about? Who was he? The words seemed to hang in the air, suffocating him, as the chill of uncertainty swept over him. Before he could say another word, the little girl turned abruptly, her feet carrying her down the alley at a speed that took Lucas by surprise. She was gone before he could react. The desperate chase, the suddenness of the girl's departure left Lucas standing frozen in the middle of the street, his pulse pounding in his ears. The words she had spoken, "He's coming," echoed through his mind like a loud, insistent alarm, but there was no time to pause and reflect. The girl had already sprinted into the shadows, her small frame quickly swallowed up by the darkness of the alley. Instinct took over. Lucas's mind raced as he pushed past the disbelief and fear that had suddenly gripped him. His hand shot out, gripping the door handle of the patrol car as he slammed it shut with urgency. There was no time to think, no time to waste. Every second felt like a heartbeat he couldn't afford to lose. He sprinted toward the alley, his boots hitting the concrete with purpose, his eyes scanning every corner, every movement in the distance. His heart hammered against his chest as he searched the narrow passageway, looking for the girl who had vanished into the shadows only moments ago. Was she hiding? Was she waiting for him to find her? The night seemed to grow darker, the air thickening with tension as he chased after her, the echo of her words still ringing in his ears. Who was she running from? Lucas couldn't shake the image of her, the small, terrified girl, so innocent in appearance, yet carrying a weight on her shoulders that no child should ever have to bear. "He's coming." The words had been so simple, yet so heavy with meaning. Was it a warning? A cry for help? He needed answers, but more than that, he needed to find her. The urgency in her voice haunted him, and for the first time in years, Lucas felt something he hadn't felt on the job. Fear. He skidded to a halt at the edge of the alley and peered into the darkness. The dim light from the street lamp barely illuminated the narrow path. His flashlight flickered in his grip as he turned it on, the beam of light slicing through the blackness. His gaze darted back and forth, but there was no sign of her. Where could she have gone? His hand tightened around the flashlight, and he took another step forward, his eyes scanning the corners of the alley. It wasn't just the girl he was concerned about. It was the sense of danger that lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. The feeling that something larger, more sinister, was unfolding before him. "Kid," he called out, his voice steady, but with a hint of urgency. "Where are you?" The silence that followed was thick, oppressive. The kind of silence that makes you second-guess every sound, every creak, every whisper of wind. For a moment, Lucas felt as if the world had stopped, as if everything had paused and was watching him. He waited for a response, his hand hovering near his radio, ready to call for backup if needed, but something deep inside him told him to hold off. This wasn't a normal situation, and whatever was going on, it was his to handle, for better or worse. The girl had reached out to him, had made it clear that she needed his help. Lucas wasn't going to let her down. Not now. He stepped further into the alley, the beam of the flashlight illuminating a trash can, an abandoned bicycle, and piles of forgotten boxes, but still no sign of the girl. She had disappeared too quickly for him to track her movements. Panic began to claw at the edges of his mind, but he pushed it away, focusing instead on the task at hand. Think, Lucas. His years of training had taught him the importance of staying calm in any situation. Whether it was a high-speed chase, a violent confrontation, or a domestic dispute, the key was to think logically. But here, now, logic seemed to fail him. The girl had disappeared. There were no signs, no clues as to where she had gone. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. "Kid," he called again, his voice louder this time. He knew he was getting closer to her. There was no way she could have gotten far, not with her small legs. But as he turned a corner of the alley, his flashlight caught something, a reflection in the distance. He rushed toward it, his breath quickening as he neared. The light caught a piece of fabric, a bright yellow shirt. He stopped in his tracks. There she is. She was standing there, just a few feet away, hidden behind a dumpster. The beam of the flashlight caught her face, and Lucas's heart skipped a beat. She was trembling, her small body shaking, but her eyes, they were wide with fear, full of something else too. Something that seemed to go beyond the terror of a child lost in the dark. She was staring at him, unblinking, her hands still clasped tightly together in front of her chest. Lucas crouched down to her level, trying not to startle her. "It's okay. You're safe now," he said, his voice gentle. He wanted to reach out to her, to reassure her, but something in her gaze held him back. There was a depth in her eyes, an understanding of something far too serious for someone so young. He took a breath, trying to steady himself. "What's your name, kid?" he asked softly. But before she could answer, her eyes darted over his shoulder, and she whispered, "He's coming." The words sent a chill down Lucas's spine, but before he could process what she meant, the girl quickly bolted again, running deeper into the alley, her footsteps echoing off the walls. Lucas didn't hesitate this time. He followed immediately, his flashlight sweeping through the alley, catching glimpses of the girl's yellow shirt as she dashed ahead. But this time, Lucas wasn't just chasing a scared little girl. He was chasing the truth. As he rounded the corner, the sound of her footsteps grew faint, and the alley grew darker still. Something had changed. The shadows didn't feel quite so empty anymore. Into the unknown. The alley seemed to stretch on longer than it should have. With every step Lucas took, the air grew colder, thicker, as if the shadows themselves were closing in around him. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light that barely illuminated the path ahead. The silence was deafening, and yet the sound of the girl's quick, frantic footsteps echoed through the narrow space, leading him further into the depths of the darkened alleyway. Where was she going? Lucas wondered, his breath coming faster now, a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline fueling his every move. His mind raced, his thoughts tangled in a web of confusion. The girl had already spoken those haunting words. He's coming. But who was he? And why was she running from him? The questions gnawed at him, pressing on his chest with the weight of their mystery. There was no logical explanation for this, no rational reason for a child to be alone in the dark, running as if her life depended on it. The girl was fast, too fast for her small frame. Lucas had been keeping pace, but she was slipping further away with each turn. The alley seemed to twist and turn in ways he hadn't remembered, and the shadows pressed in from every side, warping the world around him. It was as if the alley itself had become a labyrinth, a maze designed to keep him from finding her. But Lucas was determined. He had to find her. The urgency in her voice, the fear in her eyes, had planted a seed of unease deep within him, and it was growing. There was something wrong here, something far bigger than just a lost child. As he rounded another corner, the alley seemed to open up into a small, secluded courtyard. The girl was standing at the far end, facing away from him. The dim light of a flickering street lamp bathed her in a soft glow, but she didn't move. She stood completely still, her small frame rigid, her back to him. Lucas paused for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest, watching her. This was it. He had caught up to her. "Kid," Lucas called out, his voice softer now, trying to calm her down. He took a step forward, his boots tapping lightly against the concrete, but she didn't flinch. She didn't turn around. The stillness in the air deepened, and for a brief moment, Lucas wondered if he had reached the wrong conclusion, that maybe this had all been a misunderstanding. Maybe the girl wasn't in danger. But no, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. This wasn't just about a lost child. "Are you okay?" he asked again, taking another slow step toward her. His voice was firm but gentle, trying to give her a sense of security, but there was a strange heaviness in the way she stood. She didn't look afraid anymore. She looked resigned, as if she knew something he didn't. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His hand instinctively went to his belt, where his radio was, but he paused, taking a deep breath. There was no time to waste. He needed answers, and he needed them now. "Where's your family?" Lucas asked, his voice steady despite the unease building within him. Finally, the girl spoke. Her voice was soft, but it carried an edge of urgency that sent a chill down his spine. "He's here." For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The words hung in the air, almost too heavy to bear. "He's here." Lucas looked around, his eyes darting back and forth across the courtyard, searching for any sign of movement, any indication of what she meant. But the courtyard was empty. There was no one else around. It was just him and the girl. Yet that feeling of being watched, of being followed, settled deeper into his bones. It was almost as if the air had thickened, grown heavier, and the shadows now felt more like an encroaching presence than mere darkness. Suddenly, the girl turned toward him, her eyes wide with fear, her small hands clenched into fists by her sides. She took a shaky step back, and in that moment, Lucas saw something he hadn't noticed before, the look of sheer terror in her eyes. It wasn't the kind of fear a child has when they're lost or scared. This was different. This was the kind of fear that came from knowing something was about to happen, something they couldn't escape. Without warning, the girl darted toward a small door at the side of the courtyard, hidden in the shadows. Her tiny figure vanished into the darkness, leaving Lucas standing there, staring at the door she had just disappeared behind. What was she running from? The question hung in the air like an unanswered prayer. Lucas didn't hesitate. His legs moved before his mind could catch up, and he was chasing after her once again, his footsteps echoing through the courtyard as he reached the door. It was a rusted metal door, old and forgotten, but it was locked. Frustration and panic rose inside him as he tried to turn the handle, pulling at the door with all his strength. He couldn't lose her now, not after everything. The girl had led him here, and he wasn't going to let her slip away. Bang! A loud crash came from behind him, followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy and fast, approaching the courtyard. Lucas's heart leaped into his throat. Who was that? He turned sharply, scanning the area, his eyes searching desperately for any sign of movement. The alley had become quiet, eerily so, but the footsteps were growing closer. Whoever, or whatever, was following him was almost here. A cold wave of realization washed over him. The girl had warned him. She had known. She had known something was coming. And now, Lucas was about to face whatever it was. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he stood there, listening, waiting for what would come next. The dark truth. The air in the courtyard felt suffocating now, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Lucas's heart was racing, each beat drumming louder in his chest as he turned his head to scan every corner, every shadow. The footsteps grew louder, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He could feel the presence drawing closer, the weight of something unseen, something dangerous, looming in the darkness. His grip on the door tightened. He had to get inside. The girl had been right. She hadn't just been running from something, someone, and he needed to protect her. Whatever was about to happen, it was bigger than him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, trying to figure out what had led him here, but he couldn't. Not in the dim light, not with the strange sense of urgency filling every corner of the alley. Suddenly, a voice cut through the silence. It was low, gravelly, and filled with an unsettling calmness. Looking for her, Lucas froze, every muscle in his body locking in place. He didn't need to look behind him to know who it was. The voice, the way it carried, told him everything he needed to know. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and imposing. The man stepped into the faint glow of the streetlight, his face hidden beneath the brim of a dark hat, his silhouette casting long shadows across the ground. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just an ordinary person. No, there was something about him. Something cold, calculating, that sent an instinctive wave of fear down his spine. His hand hovered near his gun, but he didn't pull it out just yet. Something told him that a confrontation wasn't necessary, at least not yet. The man smirked, the shadow of a grin barely visible beneath his hat. "You've been following her, haven't you? You think you're helping, but she's mine. She always has been." Lucas stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you? And what do you want with that girl?" His voice was steady, but inside, the adrenaline was coursing through him, urging him to act. He couldn't let this go. Not now. The man chuckled darkly. "She doesn't belong here. She never did. You think you can protect her. You think you can save her from me." He stepped closer, the air growing colder with every step he took. "You've already failed her once, officer, but don't worry. She won't be running from me anymore." The finality of the words hit Lucas like a punch in the gut. He had been chasing shadows, trying to protect someone who had already been marked, who had already been caught in a web far more complicated than he had imagined. "She trusted you," the man said, his voice now a cold whisper, "and that's the biggest mistake she's ever made." Lucas's mind raced, piecing together fragments of the girl's frantic behavior, her warning. He's coming. But it wasn't just fear, it was something darker. The girl hadn't been a random child. She hadn't been lost or confused. She had been trying to escape something far worse, someone far worse. Before Lucas could react, the man moved again, fast, closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. The world around Lucas seemed to spin, and his body instinctively moved to protect the girl, his charge, the one person he had promised to help. But when he turned toward the door again, the girl was no longer there. She was gone. The darkness seemed to swallow her whole, and for a moment, Lucas stood frozen, a sense of dread gnawing at him, pulling at his chest. The man in front of him was only part of the story. The girl, the one who had come to him for help, the one who had trusted him, was the key. And now, in this moment, she was slipping away again, lost to the shadows. "Where is she?" Lucas demanded, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he simply watched, his eyes glowing with a cold satisfaction. He had won. He had already claimed what was his. Lucas's breath quickened, but he knew that this was far from over. He couldn't let the girl fade into the darkness again. He couldn't let whatever this man was have her. Without thinking, Lucas turned and ran back toward the alley's mouth, toward the last place he had seen her. His flashlight beam bounced erratically, searching the shadows for any sign of the girl. "Help me." The words still echoed in his mind. He had to act. He had to save her, but where had she gone? As he ran, the faintest glimmer of yellow caught his eye. The bright yellow t-shirt she had been wearing, barely visible in the distance. Lucas's heart skipped a beat as he pushed forward, running faster, ignoring the sharp sting of the cold night air on his skin. Then, as if the world had shifted once again, he saw her. She was standing there, in the shadows of an old building, waiting for him. Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, there was something different in them, something calmer. She wasn't running anymore. "I told you he was coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lucas's chest tightened, but he couldn't move. He was standing in front of her now, and for the first time, everything clicked. "He's coming," she had said. But who was he? The girl stepped forward and placed her hand in his, as if guiding him toward something. "You're not alone, officer." "Not anymore," she said, her voice steady now, with a hint of determination that Lucas had never expected from a child. Before he could say another word, the alley seemed to close in, the shadows stretching and blending until he couldn't tell where the light ended and the dark began. And in that final, haunting moment, Lucas understood. He had not been chasing a lost child. He had been chasing the truth, and now, it was leading him into the heart of a mystery far larger than he had ever imagined. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.